The warning lights on the prison transport ship flashed red as Captain Yoon read the transfer orders for the third time. The documents were clear, but they still made no sense. They wanted him to dump a single human prisoner into Sector 7 of the HFY Maximum Security Facility. Not the normal holding cells. Not the processing center. Sector 7, everyone in the Galactic Penal Authority knew about. Sector 7. It was where they sent prisoners who were too dangerous to execute but too violent to contain anywhere else. The sector was a war zone where 12 different alien species fought each other every day. Guards only entered in full combat armor, and even then, they rarely came back out alive. "Sir," his second officer called from the navigation station. "Are you sure about these coordinates?" Sector 7 is marked as a combat zone. Captain Yoon looked at the prisoner file again. Kim, it said, no last name recorded. Male human from the planet Earth, age 28 standard years. The charges filled 3 pages, but what caught Yoon's attention were the escape records. 17 different prisons. 17 successful breakouts. The longest any facility had held him was 4 months. "The orders are clear," Yoon said finally. "Emergency drop pod deployment directly into Sector 7. The captain walked down the narrow corridor to the holding cells. The human sat quietly in the corner of his cell, reading something on a small tablet. He looked ordinary. Average height for a human, maybe 1.8 meters tall. Brown hair, dark eyes. Nothing special about him at all. Certainly nothing that screamed, dangerous criminal. "Kim," Yoon called through the energy barrier. "You're being transferred." The human looked up and smiled. It was not the smile of someone afraid or angry. It was almost friendly. "Where to this time, Captain?" "HFY facility." Kim nodded as if this was normal conversation. "Never been there. What's it like?" Yoon stared at him. Most prisoners begged or threatened when they learned about a transfer. This human acted like they were discussing the weather. "It's a maximum security facility. I figured that much." Kim stood up and stretched. "Well, I suppose we should get going then." The transfer process was simple. Kim walked calmly into the drop pod without restraints or complaints. The pod was designed for emergency evacuation, not prisoner transport, but it would work for a one-way trip. Once Kim was inside, the pod would be ejected toward the planet's surface. Auto-navigation would guide it to the drop coordinates in Sector 7. "Any last requests?" Yoon asked as he sealed the pod door. "Could you ask them to have some coffee ready?" Kim replied, "I haven't had good coffee in months." The captain shook his head and activated the launch sequence. The pod shot away from the transport ship like a small meteor, carrying its human cargo toward the most dangerous prison in the galaxy. Down on the planet's surface, Warden Crystal watched the pod's descent on his monitoring screens. The Warden was a Velthari, an insect-like species with 4 arms and compound eyes. His chitinous shell was scarred from years of prison work, and his mandibles clicked with satisfaction as he tracked the pod's progress. "Another problem solved," he said to his deputy warden, a human named Hejin. Hejin nodded but looked uncomfortable. "Sir, dropping a prisoner directly into Sector 7 without processing. Is that legal?" "The human has escaped from 17 facilities," Crystal replied. "Normal procedures don't work on him. Sector 7 will solve our problem permanently." The warden's compound eyes reflected the glow of the monitoring screens. Sector 7 was his greatest success and his darkest secret. By allowing the prisoners to fight each other constantly, he maintained control without effort. The different alien species naturally formed gangs based on their biology and culture. The Gorvak were strong and aggressive. The Seth were fast and venomous. The Mektar had cybernetic enhancements that made them nearly unstoppable in combat. All these groups hated each other. They fought over food, water, territory, and sometimes just for entertainment. The guards only had to throw in basic supplies once a week and clean up the bodies. It was efficient, cost-effective, and kept the most dangerous criminals in the galaxy busy killing each other instead of planning escapes. "How long do you think the human will last?" Hejin asked. "The average survival time for new arrivals in Sector 7 is 6 hours, Crystal said. Humans are physically weak compared to most species there. I give him 3 hours at most. The drop pod slammed into the ground in the center of Sector 7's main courtyard. Dust and debris scattered in all directions as the impact crater smoked in the artificial daylight. The facility's dome ceiling projected a pale yellow sun, but it cast harsh shadows that made everything look cold and threatening. Dozens of alien prisoners emerged from their hiding spots to investigate the crash. They moved carefully, weapons ready. New arrivals usually meant fresh supplies or equipment that could be scavenged from their bodies. The pod's door hissed open, and Kim stepped out. He looked around slowly, taking in his surroundings. The courtyard was scarred with blast marks and dried bloodstains. Broken weapons littered the ground. The air smelled of burnt metal and something worse that Kim didn't want to identify. A massive Gorvak stepped forward from the crowd. Thok was 3 meters tall and covered in thick, gray hide that looked like living stone. His forearms ended in claws that could tear through steel, and his small red eyes burned with constant anger. Scars covered his body from countless battles. Another soft one, Thok growled in broken galactic standard. What gang you join, little human? Kim brushed dust off his prison uniform and looked up at the giant alien. I'm Kim, nice to meet you. The Gorvik stared down at him. Other prisoners laughed at Kim's polite response. A Seth slithered closer, her snake-like body coiling as she prepared to strike. Her name was Syl, and she was known for poisoning new arrivals just to watch them die slowly. No manners here, human, Syl hissed. Only strength. Kim nodded thoughtfully. I can see that. This place has seen a lot of fighting. More laughter from the crowd. They had expected begging or threats or desperate attempts to run. This calm acceptance was something new. A human voice called out from the back of the group. Kim, over here. Everyone turned to see Lee, the only other human in Sector 7. He was thin and nervous, with gray hair and quick eyes that never stopped moving. He had survived in the sector for 2 years by staying invisible and never taking sides in any conflicts. You know this one? Thok demanded. We're the same species, Lee said quickly. I can explain the rules to him. Thok considered this for a moment, then shrugged. Fine, but he chooses gang by tomorrow, or we choose for him. The crowd dispersed slowly, disappointed that there wouldn't be immediate violence. Thok and Syl exchanged glances that promised future conflict, but for now they returned to their territories. Lee hurried over to Kim. Are you insane? He whispered. You can't just be polite to them. They'll eat you alive. Kim looked around the courtyard again, studying the defensive positions, the territorial markings, the way different species grouped together. How long have they been fighting? Forever, Lee said. Since before I got here, maybe since this place opened. And what are they fighting about? Lee blinked. What do you mean? They're criminals. They fight because that's what they do. Kim picked up a piece of broken metal from the ground and examined it. It looked like part of a water purification system. Everyone fights for a reason, Lee, even if they forget what that reason was. As the artificial sun began to set, Kim sat down on a chunk of debris and continued studying his new home. Around him, the prisoners of Sector 7 prepared for another night of violence and survival. But for the first time in years, some of them found themselves wondering what the strange, new human was really thinking about. Kim woke up to the sound of screaming. The artificial dawn had just begun to brighten the dome ceiling when the violence started. Kim sat up from where he had slept against a concrete barrier and watched 3 Mektar drag a smaller alien toward the execution pit. The victim was a Velthari like the warden, but this one was missing 2 of his 4 arms and looked half-starved. Daily entertainment, Lee whispered from beside him. He had spent the night teaching Kim the basic survival rules of Sector 7. The Mektar Collective likes to start each day with a killing, keeps everyone else afraid. The Mektar were cybernetically enhanced beings who had replaced most of their original bodies with mechanical parts. Their leader in Sector 7 was a female called Park, though her original species was impossible to determine under all the metal and circuitry. She watched the execution with glowing red optical sensors while Her followers held the struggling Velt HARI. Kim stood up and started walking toward the execution pit. "What are you doing?" Lee hissed, grabbing his arm. "You can't interfere, that's suicide." "I'm not interfering," Kim said calmly. "I'm just going to watch." The execution pit was a shallow depression in the center of the courtyard, stained dark with old blood. Around it, prisoners from different gangs had gathered to watch the morning's entertainment. The Gorveks stood in their usual spot near the food dispensers. The Seth coiled together on the raised platform they had claimed as territory. Other smaller groups filled in the spaces between the major powers. Park raised one cybernetic arm, and her followers forced the Velthari to his knees at the edge of the pit. "This one was caught stealing food from our stores," she announced in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "The penalty is death?" The doomed prisoner looked around desperately for help, but no one moved. This was how things worked in Sector 7. The strong killed the weak, and everyone else watched to learn who to avoid. Kim stepped forward from the crowd. "Excuse me," he said politely. "What did he steal?" Park's optical sensors focused on him with mechanical precision. "Who are you to question the collective?" "I'm Kim. I'm new here." He smiled at her the same way he had smiled at Captain Yoon. "I was just curious about what food is worth dying for." The cybernetic woman studied him for a long moment. Around the pit, other prisoners waited to see if there would be 2 executions this morning. "A nutrition bar," she said finally. "Standard prison ration," Kim nodded thoughtfully. "Just one?" "One is enough." He must have been very hungry. Kim looked at the trembling Valthari. "When did he last eat?" "That is not your concern, human. You're right," Kim agreed. "I was just wondering if maybe there's a reason someone would risk dying for one nutrition bar." Park's followers shifted restlessly. This was not how executions usually went. There was supposed to be quick violence, not conversation. Their leader's optical sensors flickered as she processed this unexpected situation. "The reason does not matter," Park said. "Rules are rules." "Of course," Kim said. "Rules keep people alive. But I'm still learning the rules here. Is stealing always punishable by death?" "It is when you steal from the collective." Kim looked around at the assembled prisoners. "What about stealing from other gangs? Same punishment?" Park hesitated. The truth was that stealing between gangs happened constantly. It was practically a form of entertainment. Only stealing from your own group was considered a serious crime. "That is different," she said. "How?" The cybernetic woman's optical sensors flashed with irritation. She had not come here to debate philosophy with a human. "Enough questions. The execution will proceed." But Kim's questions had created something dangerous in Sector 7. Doubt. The watching prisoners were thinking about the rules that governed their lives. Some of them were remembering the last time they had been hungry enough to risk everything for a single meal. A voice spoke up from the Gorvek section. "Wait, everyone!" Turned to see Ru step forward. He was smaller than most Gorvek, with gray hide instead of the usual brown or black. His red eyes held intelligence that was rare among his species. While other Gorvek solved problems with violence, Ru sometimes tried to think first. "The human asks good questions," Ru said slowly. "Why do we have these rules?" Park's optical sensors swiveled toward him. "Because without rules there is chaos." "But we already have chaos," Ru pointed out. "We fight every day. We kill each other for scraps. How is this not chaos?" Thok growled from his position near the food dispensers. "Ru speaks too much. Thinking makes Gorvek weak." But other voices were joining the conversation now. A Seth named Minho raised his triangular head. "The human is right to ask questions. When did any of us last have enough food?" "Yesterday I saw Jin throw away half a nutrition bar," added another prisoner. "If there is enough food to waste, why do we fight over it?" Park realized that control of the situation was slipping away. She had come here to demonstrate power through violence, but somehow the conversation had become about hunger and fairness, and questions that had no easy answers. "Silence," she commanded, raising her cybernetic arm again. "The execution continues." But when her followers moved to carry out the order, they hesitated. The questions Kim had asked were simple ones, but they had started something dangerous. Thinking, Kim stepped closer to the pit. "I have a question about the collective's rules," he said to Park. "Are they written down somewhere?" "They are programmed into our systems. Could I see them? I want to make sure I understand correctly." Park's optical sensors flickered rapidly. The truth was that most of the rules in Sector 7 were just traditions that had grown up over years of violence. There was no written code, no system of justice. Just the strong taking from the weak because they could. "The rules are clear," she said finally. "I'm sure they are," Kim agreed. "But I'm a visual learner. Could someone show me where it says that stealing one nutrition bar requires execution?" The silence stretched long enough that some prisoners began to shift nervously. The morning execution was supposed to be over by now. The daily routine was being disrupted by questions that no one knew how to answer. Finally, Park's optical sensors went dark for a moment. When they lit up again, she spoke in her grinding metal voice. "The collective will consider your questions. The execution is postponed." She turned and walked away, her followers releasing the grateful Velthari and hurrying after her. Around the pit, prisoners dispersed slowly, talking among themselves in low voices. Lee appeared at Kim's elbow, his face pale with shock. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" "I asked some questions. You challenged Park in front of everyone." "She can't let that go." "The collective will come for you tonight." Kim nodded calmly. "Probably, but did you notice something interesting?" "What?" She didn't answer any of my questions. As they walked back toward their sleeping area, Kim continued studying the layout of Sector 7. He noticed how the different gangs had claimed territories that controlled access to important resources. The Gorvak held the food dispensers. The Seth controlled the only working medical station. The Mektar had taken over the power distribution center, but there were other things Kim noticed that escaped most prisoners. Broken equipment that could be repaired. Unused spaces that could serve important functions. Systems that worked inefficiently because no one had ever thought to organize them better. Most importantly, he noticed that despite all their fighting, the prisoners shared certain basic needs: food, water, safety, medical care, and something to do besides survive. They fought over these things because they believed there wasn't enough to go around. But Kim was starting to suspect that wasn't actually true. As the day progressed, he watched the normal routine of Sector 7 unfold. Small raids between gangs. Territory disputes over prime sleeping spots. Arguments over the few working pieces of equipment. Violence that erupted suddenly and ended just as quickly, but now some prisoners were watching Kim as much as they watched each other. Word was spreading about the human who had stopped an execution with questions. Some thought he was brave. Others thought he was stupid. A few were starting to wonder if he might be something else entirely. That evening, as Kim sat eating his single nutrition bar, Rue approached him. The thoughtful Gorvik sat down carefully, his massive frame making the ground shake slightly. "Why did you save the Velthari?" Rue asked. Kim looked up at him. "Did I save him?" "You stopped his execution?" "I just asked some questions." Rue considered this. "Questions can be more dangerous than weapons, sometimes," Kim agreed. "But they can also be more useful." The Gorvak stared at him with those intelligent red eyes. "What are you really doing?" "Here, human." Kim smiled and took another bite of his nutrition bar. "I'm trying to figure out what everyone is really fighting about." In the distance, Park's optical sensors glowed in the darkness as she and her collective planned their response to the morning's humiliation. But for the first time in years, some prisoners in Sector 7 went to sleep thinking about questions instead of violence. Kim spent his third day in Sector 7 doing something no prisoner had ever done before. He took a census, while the other inmates prepared for the daily territorial battles. Kim walked through each section of the facility with a small piece of metal he had sharpened into a writing tool. He scratched marks on a flat piece of debris, counting prisoners and noting which species belonged to which gangs. "What are you doing?" asked Jin, a former Seth assassin who had been watching Kim with growing curiosity. Learning, Kim replied, making another mark on his makeshift tablet. Did you know there are 237 prisoners in Sector 7? Jin's serpentine head tilted in confusion. Why does that matter? Well, the food dispensers deliver 300 nutrition bars every day. That means if we distributed them evenly, everyone would get more than 1 bar per day. The strong take what they need, Jin said automatically. That is the way, Kim nodded and made another note. I've been watching the distribution pattern. The Gorvak take about 60% of the food because they control the dispensers. The Mektar Collective gets 20%. The Seth get 15%. Everyone else fights over the remaining 5%. He looked up at Jin. You're Seth, but you're not part of Sil's gang. When did you last have a full nutrition bar? Jin's forked tongue flicked out nervously. 3 days ago, and before that, maybe a week. Kim made another mark. So you're getting about 1/7 of the nutrition you need to stay healthy. No wonder everyone's angry all the time. This was not the kind of conversation Jin was used to having. In his old life, he had been a paid killer who solved problems with poison and stealth. Numbers and logic were not his weapons of choice. But Kim's calm analysis was strangely compelling. The distribution cannot be changed, Jin said. Finally, the Gorvak are too strong. Maybe, Kim agreed. But what if we didn't need to change it? He led Jin to a section of the facility that most prisoners avoided. It was filled with broken equipment and debris from old gang wars. Kim had been exploring it during his free time, much to Lee's horror. Look at this, Kim said, pointing to a large machine covered in dust and scorch marks. It's a protein synthesizer. Not broken, just disconnected from power. Jin stared at the machine. So it could make food. Not just nutrition bars, but actual meals. Fresh protein, vegetables, even coffee, but it has no power. Kim smiled and pointed to another piece of equipment nearby. That's a backup generator. Also not broken, just out of fuel. And over there is a fusion cell that still has about 60% charge remaining. Jin's reptilian eyes widened as he began to understand. You could repair these? We could repair them, Kim corrected. I know some basic engineering, but I'd need help. There's a Mektar named Park who probably knows more about power systems than anyone in the facility. Park tried to kill you yesterday? No, she tried to maintain control. Those are different things. Kim sat down on a piece of debris and gestured for Jin to join him. Tell me about Park. What was she like before she became leader of the collective? Jin coiled his lower body and settled beside the human. This was another strange experience, having a conversation instead of planning violence. She was an engineer on a cargo ship, got caught smuggling weapons to a rebel group, so she knows how machines work. Yes, but she will not help you. You embarrassed her in front of everyone. Kim nodded thoughtfully. What if helping me was her idea? Before Jin could ask what that meant, shouting erupted from the main courtyard. They hurried back to find Thok and 2 other Gorvaks standing over a badly beaten Velthari. It was the same prisoner Kim had helped save from execution. This one was caught near our food stores again, Thok announced to the gathering crowd. This time there will be no questions. Kim stepped forward, but instead of challenging Thok directly, he turned to address the crowd. Has anyone noticed that we're all hungrier than we should be? Thok growled in confusion. What? The Gorvak control. The food dispensers and take most of the nutrition bars, Kim continued, speaking to the assembled prisoners. But Thok, when did you last feel truly full? The massive alien's red eyes narrowed. I eat enough, but when did you feel full? Really satisfied, like you'd had a good meal, Thok hesitated. The truth was that even with access to the best food, in Sector 7 he was always slightly hungry. The nutrition bars provided basic sustenance, but they weren't satisfying. This is not important, he said finally. Maybe it is, Kim replied. What if I told you I found a way to make real food? Not just nutrition bars, but actual meals that would leave everyone feeling full and satisfied? Murmurs spread through the crowd. The idea of real food was something most prisoners hadn't considered in years. Park pushed forward from the collective section. Impossible. The facility only provides basic sustenance. The facility provides what we accept, Kim said. But there's other equipment here. Broken machines that could be repaired. Systems that could be improved. He pointed toward the abandoned section he had been exploring. There's a protein synthesizer over there that could feed everyone in Sector 7, a medical fabricator that could treat injuries. Even an entertainment system that might give us something to do besides fight. If such machines existed and could be repaired, why has no one done this before? Park demanded. Kim looked around at the assembled prisoners. Gorvak, Seth, Mektar, Velthari, and a dozen other species. Because it would require cooperation. The Gorvak are strong enough to move heavy equipment, but they don't know how machines work. The Mektar understand technology, but they need access to areas controlled by other gangs. The Seth are small enough to reach tight spaces for repairs, but they need protection while working. He paused to let this sink in. Everyone has something necessary, but no one has everything necessary. Syl slithered closer, her yellow eyes suspicious. What do you gain from this, human? The same thing everyone else gains. Better food, better medical care, less time spent fighting over scraps. And in return? In return, we work together instead of against each other. The silence that followed was different from the usual tense quiet of Sector 7. This was the silence of minds wrestling with a new possibility. Rue spoke first. The human speaks truth about cooperation. Gorvak are strong, but strength alone cannot repair machines. Park's optical sensors flickered as she processed this information. The collective possesses technical knowledge but lacks access to many facility areas. Even Syl seemed to be considering the proposal. Seth can reach small spaces, but we are vulnerable to attack while working. Kim nodded. So we could help each other. Or we could keep fighting over nutrition bars while surrounded by machines that could make all our lives better. Thok looked down at the beaten Velthari, then at the crowd of hungry prisoners, then at Kim. If these machines can be made to work, the Gorvak will consider cooperation. The collective will also consider this proposal, Park added reluctantly. Syl hissed softly. The Seth will watch and decide. As the crowd began to disperse, Lee hurried over to Kim. Do you really think you can make those machines work? Kim picked up his makeshift writing tool and added more marks to his debris tablet. I think we can make them work. But more importantly, I think we can make something else work. What? Kim looked around at the prisoners returning to their territories. But for the first time since his arrival, they weren't preparing for immediate violence. They were thinking, community, Kim said simply. That evening, as artificial sunset dimmed the dome ceiling, something unprecedented happened in Sector 7. Instead of the usual raids and territorial conflicts, small groups from different gangs began meeting to discuss Kim's proposal. They were careful, suspicious meetings. No one was ready to trust completely. But they were talking instead of fighting. Jin found Kim sitting in his usual spot, still making marks on his metal tablet. What are you writing now? A list of what needs to be repaired, who has the skills to do it, and how we might organize the work. Kim looked up at the former assassin. Want to help? Jin settled beside him, and for the first time in his criminal career, began planning something that might help people instead of hurt them. In the distance, the gang leaders were having their own conversations, trying to figure out if cooperation was possible or if this was all an elaborate trap. But even their suspicious discussions were better than the usual cycle of violence and revenge. Change was coming to Sector 7, one conversation at a time. The crisis began at dawn on Kim's fifth day in Sector 7. The main water purifier had finally broken down completely. For months, it had been producing less and less clean water, forcing the gangs to ration their supplies more strictly. Now it sat silent and dark, its control panel flashing angry red warning lights. Kim woke to the sound of angry voices growing louder by the minute. He found Lee crouched behind their sleeping barrier, looking terrified. This is bad, Lee whispered. Really bad. The gangs have been talking about cooperation, but without water, they'll be at each other's throats within hours. Through gaps in their shelter, Kim could see prisoners gathering around the silent purifier. The mood was ugly and getting worse. Thok stood with 6 other Gorvek, their massive forms blocking access to the machine. Park and her collective had taken position on the opposite side, optical sensors glowing with aggressive light. Seth. Gang coiled in the shadows, ready to strike. Gorvek controlled the water yesterday, Thok rumbled. Gorvek will control it today. The collective maintains all technical equipment, Park replied, her metallic voice cutting through the morning air. This machine falls under our jurisdiction. Neither of you can fix it, Syl hissed from her position. Perhaps the Seth should? Take control of broken things. Kim stood up and walked toward the confrontation. Lee grabbed his arm desperately. Don't, Lee pleaded. They'll kill you just for getting close. When the gangs fight over water, everyone else dies. But Kim was already moving toward the crowd. He stopped a few meters away from the 3-way standoff and raised his voice. Excuse me, he called out politely. Is anyone here familiar with the technical specifications of this purifier model? The gang leaders turned to stare at him. The question was so unexpected that it cut through their anger like a blade. What does that matter? Thok demanded. Well, if we're going to fight over who controls it, we should probably know if it can be fixed first, Kim replied reasonably. Otherwise, we're fighting over a pile of broken metal. Park's optical sensors focused on him. The collective has examined the machine. The primary filtration matrix has failed catastrophically. Repair is impossible without replacement components. What kind of components? Molecular filtration membranes, ionic exchange crystals, and a quantum purification core? Park's voice carried the satisfaction of technical superiority. None of these items are available in the facility, Kim nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right. Those components aren't available. He paused and looked around at the angry prisoners. But do we need this specific machine to get clean water? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in Sector 7 had grown up believing that the water purifier was their only source of clean drinking water. It had always been there, humming quietly in the corner of the facility. When it worked, they fought over access to it. When it broke, they fought over who would fix it. There is no other source, Syl said dismissively. Actually, there might be. Kim walked over to a section of wall near the broken purifier and pointed to a sealed maintenance panel. Has anyone ever opened this? Those panels contain only pipes. And wiring, Park said. Nothing useful. Maybe, but this panel is different from the others. Kim knelt down and examined the edges of the panel. Look at the seal. It's much newer than the walls around it. And there are wear marks here, like it's been opened recently. He stood up and addressed the crowd. I'd like to open this panel and see what's inside. Is that okay with everyone? The gang leaders exchanged suspicious glances. This was not how territorial disputes were supposed to work. There should be threats, posturing, and eventually violence. Kim's calm scientific approach was throwing off their entire system. Open it, Rue said from the edge of the crowd. If there is nothing useful inside, we lose nothing. Other voices began supporting the idea. Even among the gangs, there were prisoners who were tired of fighting and curious about alternatives. Park stepped forward. The collective will oversee the investigation. We possess the technical expertise to understand any equipment discovered. Course? Kim agreed. And I'll need someone strong to help remove the panel. It looks pretty heavy, Thok grunted. Gorvek's strength is required for such work. And someone with small, precise hands to examine any delicate components, Kim added. Looking at Syl, the Seth leader's yellow eyes narrowed suspiciously, but she nodded. Seth fingers are suited for detailed work. What Kim had done was simple but revolutionary. Instead of fighting over who would control the investigation, he had given each gang a vital role in the process. They were working together because they each had something necessary to contribute. The panel came off easily once Thok applied his considerable strength to it. Behind the metal covering was a space filled with pipes, but these weren't the usual water distribution lines. They were much larger and made of a different material. These are backup systems, Park said, her optical sensors scanning the revealed equipment. Secondary water processing lines that bypass the main purifier. Kim squeezed into the space beside her. So this is an alternate water source? It appears so. But these systems show no signs of recent activation. Syl slithered closer and examined the control mechanisms with her delicate fingers. The activation switches are corroded. But the corrosion is surface only. The underlying systems appear functional. Kim felt a surge of excitement, but he kept his voice calm. So we might be able to get clean water from this backup system? Theoretically. Possible, Park admitted. But it would require cleaning the control mechanisms, testing the filtration systems, and recalibrating the distribution networks. How long would that take? Working alone, the collective could complete the task in perhaps 10 days. Fox stepped forward. 10 days without water, many will die. But what if we all work together? Kim asked. The collective has the technical knowledge. The Gorvak have the strength to move heavy components. The Seth can handle the delicate cleaning work. How long would it take then? Park's optical sensors flickered as she calculated. With sufficient assistance, perhaps 6 hours. The crowd stirred with excitement. 6 hours without water was survivable. 10 days was not. What do you need? Rue asked for the next few minutes. Park explained the work required in technical terms that most prisoners didn't understand. But Kim translated her instructions into simple tasks that anyone could perform. The Gorvak will move the heavy filtration units from storage to the main line, he summarized. The Seth will clean the control mechanisms and test the delicate sensors. The Mektar Collective will handle the technical calibration and system integration. What about everyone else? Asked a Velthari prisoner, Kim looked around at the dozens of non-gang prisoners who usually survived by hiding and scavenging. We'll need people to organize tools, carry messages between work teams, and keep watch for any problems. Everyone has something useful to contribute. The work began immediately. Kim had expected some resistance, but the prospect of clean water proved more motivating than old territorial habits. Gorvak prisoners who normally fought Seth on site found themselves working side by side, sharing tools and coordinating their efforts. The most remarkable moment came when a young Seth working on a corroded control panel accidentally triggered a small electrical discharge. Instead of attacking him for the mistake, Thok actually asked if he was injured and offered to help. This is impossible, Lee whispered to Kim as they watched the unprecedented cooperation. They've been enemies for years. How are they working? Together like this? They were never really enemies, Kim replied, handing a tool to a passing Mektar. They were competitors for limited resources. When you change the resource situation, you change the relationship. As the hours passed, the backup water system slowly came online. Park's technical expertise guided the repair work, while Gark's strength handled the heavy lifting and Seth's precision cleaned the delicate components. Other prisoners contributed in dozens of small ways that proved essential to the project's success. When clean water finally began flowing from the restored taps, a cheer went up from the entire facility. For the first time in months, everyone had access to unlimited clean water. But Kim noticed something even more significant than the successful repair. As the work team celebrated their achievement, they didn't immediately separate back into their territorial gangs. Instead, they stayed together, talking and laughing and sharing the satisfaction of a job well done. The Seth worked well today, Thok admitted grudgingly. Gorvik's strength was essential to success, Park replied, which was the closest thing to a compliment anyone had ever heard from the collective. Even Syl seemed pleased. Perhaps cooperation has advantages we had not considered. As evening approached and the prisoners settled in for the night, Kim made a new entry on his metal tablet. Not about resources or work assignments, but about something much more important. Trust. For the first time since the facility opened, the gangs of Sector 7 had proven they could work together toward a common goal. The water crisis had forced them to cooperate, but Kim suspected it wouldn't be the last time they chose to help each other instead of fight. Change was happening, one successful project at a time. Word of the water crisis solution spread through Sector 7 like wildfire, but it carried far beyond the facility's walls. Within hours, guards in other sections were reporting unusual behavior from their prisoners. Inmates who normally fought over scraps were sharing food. Gang leaders were asking questions about broken equipment instead of planning raids. Warden Crickstall noticed the changes on his monitoring screens. Security alerts, which usually flashed constantly across his displays, had dropped to their lowest levels in the facility's history. The daily violence reports from Sector 7 showed a 90% reduction in incidents. "This is impossible," he muttered, his compound eyes reflecting the glow of the surveillance feeds. "Run a full diagnostic on the monitoring systems?" Deputy Warden Hedgen checked the diagnostic results twice before reporting. "All systems functioning normally, sir." "The data is accurate." Crickstall's mandibles clicked with agitation. "Then explain how the most violent prisoners in the galaxy have suddenly become peaceful." "It appears to be connected to the human prisoner Kim," Hedgen said reluctantly. "Since his arrival, there has been a pattern of increased cooperation and decreased violence. One human cannot change an entire prison population." "Perhaps not directly, sir. But our behavioral analysts suggest that he has introduced new social dynamics that are spreading through the facility." The warden pulled up the specific footage from the water crisis. He watched Kim organize the repair teams, coordinate between gang leaders, and somehow convince natural enemies to work together. It was unlike anything in his decades of prison administration experience. What is he doing differently? Crickstall demanded. Hedgen highlighted sections of the footage. Instead of competing for control, he appears to be creating situations where cooperation benefits everyone. He identifies problems that require multiple skill sets to solve, then assigns roles that make each gang feel valuable. That should not work, but it is working, sir, and the effect is spreading. The spreading effect was exactly what worried Crickstall most. That afternoon, prisoners in Sector 4 had formed an interspecies work group to repair their exercise equipment. Sector 6 had established a voluntary food-sharing program that reduced theft by 80%. Even the maximum security cells in Sector 1 were reporting requests for books and educational materials. The prison's entire control system was based on keeping prisoners divided and desperate. If they started cooperating and improving their conditions, the whole structure could collapse. "Bring me everything we have on this human," Crickstall ordered. Meanwhile, in Sector 7, Kim was discovering that success created its own problems. The water repair project had been so successful that prisoners were approaching him with a dozen new ideas for improvements. Some wanted to fix the broken entertainment systems. Others suggested organizing educational classes. A few even proposed creating a council to handle disputes without violence. "Slow down," Kim said to the enthusiastic crowd that had gathered around him after the evening meal. "These are all good ideas, but we need to think about them carefully." "Why wait?" asked Minho, a reformed Gorvak who had become one of Kim's strongest supporters. "We proved cooperation works. We should fix everything now." Jin nodded agreement. "The longer we delay, the more chance someone will try to stop us." This was Kim's biggest concern. The cooperation between gangs was still fragile, based more on shared success than genuine trust. If they pushed too hard too fast, old territorial instincts might reassert themselves. "Park," Kim called to the collective leader. "How many major repair projects could we handle at the same time without overwhelming our resources?" Park's optical sensors flickered as she calculated. Given current skill distribution and available materials, the collective estimates a maximum of 3 concurrent projects. And if something goes wrong with one of them? Failure in any project could undermine confidence in the cooperation model, Park admitted. The psychological impact could destroy all progress. Kim nodded. This was the challenge of building something new. Every success had to be protected and built upon, while every failure could undo everything they had accomplished. "So we need to choose our next projects carefully," he said to the assembled group. "What would give us the biggest improvement in quality of life with the lowest risk of failure?" The discussion that followed was unlike anything that had ever happened in Sector 7. Instead of gang leaders making unilateral decisions, the entire community debated options and weighed consequences. Different perspectives were not only tolerated, but actively sought out. Rue suggested repairing the medical fabricator, since health problems affected everyone regardless of gang affiliation. Sil proposed fixing the food synthesizer, which would reduce competition for nutrition bars. A Velthari named Tyke recommended establishing a workshop area where prisoners could learn new skills, but it was Lee who raised the most important concern. What happens when the guards notice what we're doing? He asked quietly. They've kept us fighting each other for years. Do you think they'll just let us build a peaceful community? The question sobered everyone. They had been so focused on solving immediate problems that they hadn't considered the larger implications of their success. The human is right to be concerned, Park said. This facility is designed to contain us through division and desperation. Cooperation threatens that containment strategy. So what do we do? Minho asked. Go back to fighting each other? No, Kim said firmly. But we need to be smart about how we proceed. Change that happens too quickly can be stopped by external force. Change that happens gradually becomes the new normal. He stood up and looked around at the group. We continue with our improvements, but we make them seem natural and gradual. We fix things quietly and spread the benefits slowly. Most importantly, we make sure that anyone who might want to stop us doesn't see us as a threat. How do we do that? Jin asked. Kim smiled. We become so obviously better than the old system that stopping us would look cruel and stupid. Over the following days, Kim's strategy proved effective. Instead of dramatic announcements and facility-wide changes, the improvements in Sector 7 happened one small step at a time. The medical fabricator was repaired during normal maintenance hours. The food synthesizer was restored using scavenged parts that appeared to be routine repairs. New classes and discussion groups started as informal gatherings that gradually became more structured. To outside observers, it looked like normal prison life with slightly better equipment. But to the prisoners living through it, every day brought noticeable improvements in their quality of life. The ripple effects continued spreading to other sectors, but slowly enough that they seemed like natural evolution rather than organized change. Guards reported that prisoners were more cooperative and easier to manage. Incident reports dropped across the entire facility. Even the budget for medical treatment and property damage began to decrease, but Kim knew they were walking a tightrope. Every success made their community stronger, but it also made them more visible to authorities, who might see cooperation as a threat to control. His concerns proved justified when Hedgen appeared in Sector 7 for an unannounced inspection. The deputy warden walked through the facility with 2 guards, ostensibly checking on equipment and prisoner welfare. But Kim noticed that Hedgen spent most of his time observing the social dynamics between different groups. Prisoner Kim, Hedgen called out as he completed his inspection. I need to speak with you. Kim approached calmly, though he noticed that several other prisoners moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary. Yes, sir? There have been reports of unusual activity in this sector. Reduced violence, improved cooperation between gangs, better maintenance of equipment. Hedgen's eyes were cold and calculating. Would you know anything about these changes? Kim met his gaze steadily. The prisoners here have been working together to solve common problems, sir. Clean water, equipment repairs, that sort of thing. And whose idea was this cooperation? It seemed like the natural thing to do, Kim replied. When everyone benefits from working together, why would anyone choose to fight? Hedgen studied him for a long moment. Indeed. Why would anyone choose to fight? He turned to leave, then paused. Continue your natural cooperation, prisoner Kim, but remember that all changes in this facility are subject to administrative review. After the deputy warden left, the prisoners gathered around Kim with worried expressions. That was a warning, Lee said. He knows what we're doing. Of course he knows, Kim replied calmly. But notice what he didn't do. He didn't order us to stop. He didn't punish anyone. He didn't even seem particularly upset. Why not? Kim looked around at their improved living conditions, the peaceful atmosphere, the evidence of productive cooperation. Because what we're doing works. We're healthier, more productive, and easier to manage. From an administrative perspective, we're the perfect prisoners. But for how long? Jin asked. Kim didn't have an answer for that question. But he knew that every day their community grew stronger, it became harder for anyone to justify destroying it. The ripple effect was becoming a wave, and waves were very hard to stop once they started moving. The emergency alert reached Warden Crickstall at 0300 hours, jolting him from his sleep cycle. Security Chief Tay's voice crackled through the communication system with barely controlled panic. Sir, we have a situation in Sector 12. The prisoners have organized some kind of ... council. They're refusing to follow standard protocols. Crickstall's compound eyes focused rapidly as he pulled up the surveillance feeds. Sector 12 was supposed to be one of the most controlled areas of the facility, housing only moderate-risk offenders. What he saw on the screens made his mandibles click with alarm. Instead of the usual scattered groups of frightened prisoners, the inmates had arranged themselves in a formal circle. They were discussing something calmly, taking turns to speak, and listening to each other with obvious respect. It looked almost like a governing body. How did this happen? Crickstall demanded. Unknown, sir. But we're receiving similar reports from Sectors 3, 8, and 15. The prisoners are organizing themselves and questioning administrative decisions. The warden's worst fears were being realized. The cooperation that had started in Sector 7 was spreading throughout the entire facility, but it was evolving beyond simple repair projects and resource sharing. The prisoners were starting to see themselves as a community with rights and voices. What are they questioning? Work assignments, food distribution, exercise schedules, communication privileges. They're not being violent or directly defiant, but they're asking for explanations and suggesting alternatives. Crickstall pulled up the facility-wide statistics that had been troubling him for weeks. Violence was down 92%. Medical incidents had dropped by 80%. Property damage was at historic lows. By every traditional measure, the prison was running more smoothly than ever before, but smooth operation was not the point. Control was the point. A prison where inmates organized councils and questioned decisions was a prison on the verge of revolution, no matter how polite they were about it. Bring me Deputy Warden Hedgen immediately, Crickstall ordered. In Sector 7, Kim was unaware of the late-night crisis meeting taking place in the administrative offices. He was focused on a different kind of crisis. The community they had built was facing its first major internal conflict. The dispute had started over something trivial, the schedule for using the newly repaired workshop area, but it had quickly escalated into a deeper argument about leadership and decision-making. Some prisoners wanted formal leaders from each gang to make all the important choices. Others preferred the informal consensus building that Kim had been facilitating. The collective requires clear hierarchies for efficient operation, Park insisted, her optical sensors flashing with agitation. Democratic processes are inefficient and lead to suboptimal outcomes. Gorvik tradition honors strength and wisdom, Thought countered. Leaders should be chosen by combat or by acclamation of their followers. Seth prefer flexibility and adaptation, Syl added. Rigid leadership structures cannot respond quickly to changing circumstances. Kim listened to the debate with growing concern. This was exactly the kind of conflict that could tear apart everything they had built. Worse, it was the kind of conflict that outside authorities could exploit to justify returning to the old system of divide and control. We're all making the same mistake, Kim said finally, stepping into the center of the arguing groups. What mistake? Rue asked. We're trying to solve a political problem with political solutions. But the real issue isn't who should lead or how decisions should be made. The real issue is what we're trying to accomplish together. He gestured around at the improved living conditions, the functioning equipment, the absence of violence. We didn't create this by electing leaders or following traditional hierarchies. We created it by identifying problems that affected everyone and finding solutions that benefited everyone. But someone must decide when there are disagreements, Park pointed out. Must they? Kim asked. What if instead of deciding who's right, we focused on understanding why people disagree? He turned to address the entire group. Park wants efficient hierarchies because the collective values productivity and clear communication. Thok believes in traditional leadership because Gorvak culture respects proven strength and wisdom. Sil prefers flexible structures because Seth's survival depends on quick adaptation to changing circumstances. Kim paused to let this sink in. Everyone's position makes sense from their perspective. The question is, can we create a system that incorporates the best aspects of all these approaches? What followed was the most sophisticated political discussion in the history of Sector 7. Instead of arguing about whose system was best, the prisoners began exploring how different decision-making methods could be used for different types of problems. Technical issues that required expertise could be handled by specialist groups led by knowledgeable individuals. Resource distribution could use consensus building to ensure fairness. Emergency situations could rely on designated coordinators who had proven their competence under pressure. It was a complex, nuanced approach that drew on the strengths of each species' cultural traditions. More importantly, it was a solution that everyone had helped create and could take ownership of, but their political evolution was about to face its greatest test. The next morning, Warden Crickstal and Deputy Warden Hedgen arrived in Sector 7 with a full security detail. The prisoners had just finished their breakfast and were preparing for the day's work projects when the authorities appeared. "Attention prisoners," Crickstal announced through his translation device. "Effective immediately, all unauthorized gatherings are prohibited. All equipment repairs must be approved through proper administrative channels. Any prisoner found organizing meetings or discussions will be subject to disciplinary action." The silence that followed was deafening. For weeks, the prisoners had grown accustomed to improving their own conditions and managing their own affairs. The sudden reimposition of arbitrary authority felt like a physical blow. Kim saw the anger building in his companions' faces. Thok's massive hands clenched into fists. Park's optical sensors began flashing red warning lights. Sil's serpentine body coiled with barely restrained aggression. This was the moment Kim had been dreading. All their progress toward cooperation and peaceful problem-solving could disappear in an explosion of violence that would justify any harsh response from the authorities. "Warden Crickstal," Kim said, stepping forward calmly, "may I ask what prompted these new restrictions?" The warden's compound eyes focused on him with obvious hostility. "Prisoner Kim, I should have expected to find you at the center of this disruption." "I'm not sure what disruption you're referring to, sir." "The prisoners in Sector 7 have been following all facility regulations while working to improve their living conditions. Unauthorized meetings, unsupervised equipment repairs, organized resistance to administrative authority." Kim nodded thoughtfully. "I can understand how those activities might appear concerning from a security perspective. But perhaps we could discuss the actual results of these activities." Before Crickstal could respond, Kim continued. "Violence in this sector is down over 90%. Medical emergencies have decreased by 80%. Equipment damage has virtually stopped. Productivity in the workshops has increased by 300%. He gestured around at the clean, well-maintained facility and the calm, healthy-looking prisoners. By every measurable standard, Sector 7 is operating more successfully than any other part of the facility. "Security is not measured only by statistics," Crickstal replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Of course not," Kim agreed. "Security is about maintaining order and ensuring that prisoners cannot threaten the facility or its staff." "But, sir, look around. Do you see any threats here?" The warden did look around, and what he saw was deeply troubling to his worldview. The prisoners stood calmly, showing no signs of aggression or defiance. The facility was cleaner and better maintained than any prison area he had ever seen. Even the guards seemed relaxed rather than tense. The methods you have used may appear successful, Crixtel said finally, but they violate established protocols for prisoner management. Then perhaps, Kim said very carefully, it might be worth considering whether those protocols are serving their intended purpose. It was a direct challenge to the entire philosophy of the prison system, delivered in the most respectful tone possible. Kim was betting everything on the hope that results would speak louder than regulations. The standoff stretched for long minutes. Crixtel looked at his security detail, at the peaceful prisoners, at the improved conditions, and at the statistical reports that showed undeniable success. The current arrangements will continue under administrative observation, he announced. Finally, any sign of genuine security risk will result in immediate intervention. As the authorities departed, the prisoners gathered around Kim with a mixture of relief and amazement. "How did you do that?" Jin asked. "How did you convince him to let us continue?" Kim looked around at the community they had built together, former enemies working side by side, problems being solved through discussion rather than violence, hope replacing despair. "I didn't convince him of anything," Kim replied. "The results convinced him. When something works this well, it becomes very hard to argue against it." But as the 3 weeks after Warden Crixtel's inspection, the impossible happened. The prisoners of Sector 7 took control of their facility without firing a shot, throwing a punch, or raising their voices. It started when the main life support system began failing. Warning lights flashed throughout the complex as air circulation dropped to dangerous levels. According to standard protocol, the guards would have sealed off the affected areas and waited for outside technical support to arrive, a process that typically took 3 to 5 days, but the prisoners had spent weeks learning how their environment actually worked. When the crisis began, Park didn't wait for official permission to examine the failing systems. Thok didn't hesitate to provide muscle for moving heavy components. Sill's team immediately began checking the delicate sensor networks that monitored air quality. They had the life support system running again in 4 hours. The guards, who had been preparing for a multi-day emergency, found themselves with nothing to do except watch the prisoners handle the crisis more efficiently than any outside team could have managed. "This changes things," Security Chief Tay reported to Warden Crixtel. "The prisoners aren't just cooperating with each other anymore. They're operating the facility." The warden studied the incident reports with growing unease. "Explain." "They've become completely self-sufficient. Equipment repair, resource management, conflict resolution, even security. The guards are essentially observers now." Crixtel's mandibles clicked rapidly. "That is unacceptable. Prisoners do not run prisons." "But sir, they're doing a better job than we were. Efficiency is up across all metrics. Costs are down. There haven't been any security incidents in over a month." "That is not the point?" But for many of the guards it was exactly the point. They had signed up to maintain order and ensure security, not to enforce arbitrary suffering. Watching the prisoners create a peaceful, productive community had changed their perspective on what their job actually meant. The transformation reached its critical moment during the night shift on a Tuesday. A power surge from the main grid triggered cascade failures throughout the facility's electrical systems. Emergency power kicked in, but it would only last 6 hours before life support began shutting down. Under normal protocols, the guards would have initiated evacuation procedures and called for emergency support. But Guard Captain Young knew that evacuation would take at least 8 hours, and emergency repair teams wouldn't arrive until the following day. Instead, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. He opened communication channels with the Prisoner Leadership Council that Kim had helped establish. "We have a facility-wide power emergency," he announced. "External support won't arrive in time. Do you have the capability to handle this internally?" Park's response was immediate. "The collective can coordinate repairs, but we need access to restricted areas and override codes for safety systems." "Understood. Access is being granted now." What followed was the most remarkable display of crisis management in the history of galactic corrections. Prisoners who had once fought each other for scraps now worked with military precision to save their entire community. Gorvac teams moved massive backup generators from storage to critical locations. Seth technicians crawled through ventilation systems to reach damaged components. Mektar engineers coordinated power rerouting with the precision of a symphony orchestra. Even the usually passive Velthari contributed by managing communication, networks, and resource logistics. Kim found himself in the facility's main control room, working alongside guards to monitor the repair progress. It was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine when he first arrived, prisoners and guards collaborating as equals to solve a common problem. How long until we have full power restored? Captain Young asked. Kim checked the status displays that Park had taught him to read. Main power should be back online in 3 hours. All critical systems will be fully operational by morning. You're certain about this? Kim looked around at the coordinated effort taking place throughout the facility. Captain, these people have been learning every system in this place for weeks. They know it better than the original designers did. The captain nodded slowly. They're not prisoners anymore, are they? No, Kim agreed. They're residents. The power restoration was completed ahead of schedule, but the real transformation was just beginning. When Warden Crickstall arrived the next morning for his damage assessment, he found something that challenged every assumption about prison administration. The facility was running perfectly. Not just functional, but optimized. Energy usage was down 20% through efficiency improvements the prisoners had implemented during the repairs. Safety systems were operating at higher levels than original specifications. Even the food service had been upgraded using techniques the multi-species community had developed. More importantly, the prisoners weren't acting like prisoners anymore. They moved through the facility with purpose and confidence. They took responsibility for problems and implemented solutions without waiting for permission. They had created a society that was more functional than many free communities. Sir, Deputy Warden Hedgen said quietly, the Galactic Penal Authority is requesting a full report on the power emergency. They want to know how we managed to prevent catastrophic failure without external support. Crickstall stared at the monitoring screens that showed peaceful, productive activity throughout every sector of the facility. What do I tell them? The truth, sir. The prisoners saved the facility. And then what? When the authority realizes that we've lost control here, what happens to us? It was Captain Young who provided the answer. Sir, with respect, we haven't lost control. We found a better way to maintain it. He gestured toward the displays showing the various sectors. Crime rates are down 95% facility-wide. Medical costs have dropped by 80%. Property damage is virtually non-existent. Productivity is at record highs. By every measure that matters to the Galactic Penal Authority, this facility is the most successful prison operation in their entire system. But the prisoners are making their own decisions, yes, sir. And their decisions consistently benefit facility operations, maintain security, and advance rehabilitation goals. Crickstall's compound eyes reflected the glow of success metrics that exceeded anything in his career. You're suggesting we officially recognize this ... arrangement? I'm suggesting we take credit for it, Young replied. The authority doesn't need to know that the prisoners are self-governing. They just need to know that we've achieved unprecedented success in all operational categories. The warden considered this for a long moment. His entire career had been built on the principle that prisoners needed to be controlled through fear and division. But the evidence before him suggested that cooperation and self-determination produced far better results. And if something goes wrong? If this peaceful community decides to revolt? Kim's voice came from the doorway where he had been listening to the conversation. Sir, why would we revolt against something we built ourselves? The warden turned to face the human who had somehow transformed the most violent prisoners in the galaxy into a functioning society. You are still criminals, still dangerous. We were dangerous when we were desperate and angry, Kim replied calmly. When people have hope and purpose and the ability to improve their own lives, they become something different. What do they become? Kim looked out at the facility where former gang leaders now taught engineering classes, where violent criminals had become community organizers, where despair had been replaced by the steady work of building something better. Citizens, he said simply. Over the following days, the word spread throughout the Galactic Corrections System. The HFY facility had achieved impossible results through innovative management techniques. Other wardens requested tours and training programs. A Galactic Penal Authority began promoting Crystal as an example of progressive corrections philosophy. None of them realized that the real innovation had nothing to do with management techniques and everything to do with recognizing that even the most dangerous criminals were still people capable of growth, cooperation, and positive change. The revolution had succeeded not through violence or rebellion, but through the simple act of proving that there was a better way to live together. And once that proof existed, it became very difficult for anyone to argue for returning to the old way of doing things. 6 months after Kim's arrival at the HFY facility, Captain Yoon returned for what should have been a routine prisoner transfer. Instead, he found himself staring at something that challenged everything he thought he knew about prisons. Punishment. And the nature of criminal behavior? The transport ship's sensors detected the facility long before visual contact, but the readings made no sense. Power consumption was optimized beyond design specifications. No distress signals, no security alerts. The communication channels carried normal administrative traffic mixed with what sounded like educational broadcasts and cultural programs. Are you certain these are the correct coordinates? Yoon's navigator asked. Verified 3 times, Yoon replied, though he shared his officer's confusion. But something's definitely different. When the facility came into visual range, the differences became obvious. The exterior walls, once scarred with blast marks and emergency repairs, had been cleaned and reinforced. Solar collectors that had been broken for years were now functioning efficiently. Even the approach beacons were upgraded with better technology than the original installation. Sir, the communications officer called out, we're receiving a landing clearance from the facility. But it's not coming from the administration tower. Where is it coming from? The prisoner housing sections. Captain Yoon authorized the landing, but kept his security team on full alert. As they descended toward the facility's landing pad, he could see prisoners moving freely in outdoor areas that had been restricted zones when he had delivered Kim months earlier. They weren't running or fighting or trying to hide. They were engaged in what looked like organized recreational activities. The landing pad itself was another surprise. It had been expanded and improved, with clear marking systems and efficient traffic control that rivaled major transportation hubs. A mixed group of prisoners and guards waited to greet the transport ship, standing together in a way that suggested cooperation rather than the usual tense supervision. Warden Krickstall approached the ship as Yoon and his crew disembarked. The insectoid official's posture was confident, almost proud, as he gestured toward the transformed facility. Captain Yoon, Krickstall said through his translation device. Welcome back to the HFY facility. I trust you'll find our operations have improved since your last visit. Improved is certainly one word for it, Yoon replied carefully. Warden, I need to ask, are the prisoners secure? More secure than they have ever been. Krickstall's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. Would you like a tour of the facility? What Yoon saw during that tour would stay with him for the rest of his career. The facility was spotless, efficiently run, and filled with the kind of purposeful activity that was usually associated with educational institutions rather than prisons. In the workshops, prisoners from different species worked together on complex engineering projects. Former gang enemies taught each other technical skills and shared tools without conflict. The same Gorvak who had once terrorized new arrivals was now leading a literacy program for non-standard speakers, the medical bay. Previously a place where injuries from violence were treated, had been transformed into a comprehensive health center where prisoners volunteered as assistants and learned medical skills. The Seth who had once poisoned enemies for entertainment was now developing New pharmaceutical compounds under proper supervision, most remarkably, the former Sector 7, the war zone where Kim had been dumped to die, was now the facility's administrative center. The prisoners had established their own council chambers, mediation services, and educational coordination offices. They were governing themselves with a sophistication that impressed even the official administrators. How is this possible? Yoon asked as they completed the tour. The human Kim introduced us to a different approach to corrections, Crystal explained. Instead of controlling through punishment, we began facilitating rehabilitation through community building. And it actually works? See for yourself. Crystal led him to the main monitoring station where Deputy Warden Hedgen was reviewing the facility's operational statistics. The numbers were extraordinary. Violence down 98%. Medical incidents reduced by 90%. Equipment damage virtually eliminated. Productivity increased by over 400%. But the most significant change, Hedgen added, is in recidivism rates. Meaning? We've had 47 prisoners complete their sentences and receive early release over the past 3 months. Of those, 43 chose to stay and continue working in the facility as paid civilian employees. Captain Yoon stared at him. They chose to stay in prison? They chose to stay in their community, Kim's voice said from behind them. Yoon turned to see the human prisoner who had somehow catalyzed this transformation. Kim looked healthier and more confident than when Yoon had delivered him months earlier, but he still wore the standard prisoner uniform. Kim,